Shaw, please.
It's a great pleasure for sure. I'm glad that we've still got Cliff's face on the screen right now so people can see him, because they won't be able to see him while he's talking. But that won't distract, I don't think, too much. To give you an idea, I published a lot of information to the membership about Cliff, and I'm certainly not going to read all of that. But Cliff and I have been friends for 12 or 15 years. And he is a fellow retired fellow retired Forest Service employee who worked out in Nevada for many years. He worked as a volunteer with the forest archaeologists there, and spent several thousand hours doing that. And in the process, he found a number of really spectacular sites out in the western Nevada deserts. And that's what he's going to be talking about tonight. I think that's probably enough said. Cliff, it's all yours.
Okay.
Thank you for helping.
Thank you, Jack. I'm going to go to my screen share here, if I can find it here, and get this thing going.
Cliff, while you're doing that, if anyone has questions for Cliff, please use the chat box. And at the end of the presentation, what I'll do is I'll go in and read the chat questions to Cliff, and he can address those.
Okay.
Cliff,
Thanks,
you're on.
Jack. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for having me do my presentation. As the first slide says, I'm a former U.S. Forest Service archaeological volunteer. Worked on the Bridgeport district for almost 15 summers. And the following presentation is going to be about some of the work I did out there, particularly related to game drives. Bridgeport Ranger District, 1 million acres, located at the Star above Mono Lake in what's Great Basin of the Western United States. Bridgeport is really an amazing place. To give you some perspective, Yosemite Park is 3/4 the size. The entire Chattahoochee National Forest is smaller than the Bridgeport Ranger District. And on Bridgeport are literally thousands and thousands of archaeology sites, which I had the good fortune to spend 10 summers in Bridgeport working directly for the district archaeologist in trying to map out, discover, and to survey as much as I could some of these sites. This is some of the landscape that I worked in. Now, part of this was to really try to comply with Section 110 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which talked about finding and protecting archaeological sites. So that was my task during those 14 summers in Bridgeport. Now, what is a game drive? That's a question I get asked a lot. First of all, it goes under a number of different names, but one of them that the academics like to use is large-scale trapping features. And what they typically have is a corral where the animals get driven into, and a couple of wing or drift fences. Now, these can be, the corral could be anywhere from maybe a couple of acres up to one on the district was 35 acres. The wing or drift fences could be a couple of 100 feet, a couple of 100 yards. We've got some that are a mile long. Some of the material used in the corral and the wing fence, which I'll show you later, some pictures, can be wood, it can be rocks, it could be stone, stacks of rock, anything to try to get the game driven into the corral. One thing that you can't see on this particular image is the fact that, and I don't know if this works here, the little red dot, is the animals are driven into this corral by potentially dogs or Native Americans, who knows, women and children driving the animals down this track. By the time they reach this point here, they can't really see the corral. This is an interesting feature. There's usually a little dip in the landscape. And so the animals come over this little rise, and then before you know it, they're down in the corral. Once they're in the corral, they're surrounded by people, and I guess they send a team in and somehow club or dispatch the animals inside the corral. Now, game drives in the Great Basin really started in earnest 5,000 to 6,000 years ago when the climate got better. It'd been pretty much of a dry spell, and there weren't a lot of people in the Great Basin. But once the conditions improved and population went up, they began to take up this whole issue of game drives. And they're usually associated with the pinyon juniper woodlands, which I'll talk about a little bit. But what's really interesting about them is they co-occur with all sorts of other sites, including hearths, petroglyphs, wickiup dwellings where people live, villages, lithic scatters, hunting blinds, bow stave trees, and probably a few others I haven't listed. They're kind of the nucleus in the Great Basin for quite an assemblage of other features and sites. This is probably the most important slide I've got, and I guess this the main point I'm trying to make here, why they're important. If you go back, what is it, over a million years ago, people lived this hunter-gatherer lifestyle in small family groups and moved seasonally based on available food supplies. This was basically the way we lived for at least until 10,000 years ago. And what's really interesting about the Great Basin archaeologists is that it deals mostly with the artifacts and features left by prehistoric nomadic hunter-gatherers who lived much like our ancestors did, countless hundreds of thousands of years ago. And this final point is probably the most important. And that is building, maintaining, and using game drives brought these family groups together seasonally. The social interactions made possible by communal hunting, including game drives, played an integral part in developing and maintaining the culture of the people living in the Great Basin. Which, again, I kind of view it as probably the same catalyst of how we came up as humans from our beginnings hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years ago. I personally feel, and again, I'm not an academic, so I can't base this on a lot of science, but that people were practicing and living much like the people in the Great Basin were living up until at least 150 years ago. This is what people were doing for the vast majority of our existence on this planet. One thing to add to this is some of this, what I'm talking about, has been written up by Brian Hockett. Now, he is the state of Nevada archaeologist for BLM, and he is probably the foremost authority on game drives in the Great Basin. And he did some great research, and at the end of the show, I've got a citation for his work. But he talked about these game drives would probably require at least 60 to 75 individuals to make this thing work. And that would be at least 7 to 10 families and an average of 6 to 8 people per family. So these people they'd be living their nomadic lives, and once or twice a year, they would get together and group up and make these game features as a communal effort. The other thing interesting about his research is he did some time motion studies and found out that this was done not so much for calories. It wasn't necessarily the most efficient thing, but primarily for the social demographic reasons that these people got together. And this quote, I think, says it all. It's from his paper, Large-Scale Trapping Features from the Great Basin. He says, and I quote, "Communal large-scale trapping transcended major fluctuations in climate and changing culture identities in the Great Basin. The social interactions made possible by communal hunting, including conflict avoidance, alliance building, matchmaking, and celebration, organized and executed by leaders, may have been one of the primary constants during the ever-changing social and ecological landscape in the Great Basin of North America." I kind of looked at as it's kind of the glue that kept everybody together as they lived their nomadic lifestyle in the Great Basin. Anyway, this is the kind of landscape I worked on for the 14 summers. Pinyon juniper and a lot of sagebrush flats. Most of the game drives would be located in this pinyon juniper area of the Great Basin. Now, the Great Basin goes from about maybe 4,000 feet elevation up to about 11,000 feet in elevation. And in the middle of this, at about 6 or 7 or 8,000 feet, is this pinyon juniper belt. Now, the primary animal that the prehistoric people were after is called pronghorn antelope. And people don't realize this. They always think of the buffalo as the primary animal out west, but really the pronghorns were just everywhere, from California to the Great Plains, Canada to Mexico. I don't think we really know how many were out there. 35 million has been tossed around, but they were definitely the primary animal that the Native Americans were after, at least in the Great Basin. Other big game species, we have the bighorn sheep and the mule deer. Now, this will give you some idea of kind of the methodology of or what they were thinking. When you have this big elevation gain from 4,000 to 11,000 feet, you're setting yourself up for migration routes. You know, you get 6 feet of snow up in the mountains, and the valleys at 4,000 feet will be completely open. So these large herds of these migrating animals would go up in the spring, up into the high country, and then they would come down in the fall. And they would pass by this pinyon juniper belt, which is where I've got all these multiple game drives labeled here. So what the Native Americans did was in this area, these choke points between canyons and lava flows and mountain ranges, and in the pinyon juniper, they would set up these game drives to try to capture these animals, both in the spring migration and in the fall migration when they went back down to the winter range. Now, again, this also shows all these, I mean, I'll go into that a little bit, how many sites there are, but there's quite a lot. One thing I've always been fascinated with is that John Muir of Yosemite Park fame actually witnessed a game drive on Mount Grant back in the late 1800s. And Mount Grant, by the way, is very close to Bridgeport. And what he said, and I quote, "On the tops of nearly every one of the Nevada mountains that I have visited, I found small, less nest-like enclosures built of stones. And on some particular spot, favorably situated with reference to well-known trails of the sheep, they built a high-walled corral with long guided wings diverging from the gateway, and into this enclosure they sometimes succeeded in driving the noble game." I just can't imagine him actually witnessing Native Americans doing this. And of course, great number of Indians were required, more indeed that they could usually muster. So they were compelled to build rows of dummy hunters out of stones along the ridge tops, which they wished to prevent the sheep from crossing. The whole ridgetop seemed to be alive with hunters. This is an actual scene from Bridgeport, where you can see the stones piled up, where the Native Americans set up these dummies to try to, again, divert the animals into this corral. It's just amazing to see this stuff. A little side note here that we're not the only ones that have these game drives. The Great Basin isn't the only area. I found this interesting, that in the Middle East, they have the same thing going on in Israel and other parts of the Middle East. And in this case, they're after the gazelle. And here's some images that I got where you can see the wing drift fences and these little corrals to try to drive the gazelle into these corrals. They were called desert kites because apparently, as they were discovered in the 1920s flying over, they look like kites in the desert. Another one is a 9,000-year-old caribou hunting site. Thanks to Tony, he gave me this information. I found this fascinating, that underneath Lake Huron is this evidence of some kind of a game drive. It's now covered with water, but apparently 9,000 years ago, it was land. So somehow they were driving animals and trying to get them into some sort of traps. Interestingly enough, even today on Bridgeport, these pictures come from Bridgeport, the BLM, who is charged with gathering up all the excess wild horses on public lands, they use a kind of a corral system. And you can see where the arrows are. There's these kind of drift fence they set up, and they have these big metal corrals. And in this case, instead of dogs and people chasing the animals, you have a helicopter. I'll tell you, it's amazing to watch that whole thing unfold. And even the horses you can see in this picture are kind of fascinated by it. Anyway, these are the kind of features that we can find out on Bridgeport related to game drives. These are some actual corral walls that I found. The one on the left, you see a lot of rocks, but you also see remains of some wood, and many of these have been burned because either the corral was burned, or in some cases, the Native Americans used fire to cut the trees down instead of stone tools. Apparently that was more efficient. So this is, what we see out there. And on the right, you see these, the way the wood is actually pointed into the corral to prevent the animals from jumping out. This is a good shot showing a typical scene, kind of the desolate nature where these game drives are located. This is miles and miles from the nearest roads. It's quite a long walk to get in there. And you can see the wood and stones. This whole thing could be 1,000 years old. Wood out in the Great Basin, particularly the juniper wood, has been known to last hundreds, maybe even potentially 1,000 years sitting on the ground because of the dry, arid climate out there. Also interesting is the fact that some of these corrals and drift fences can be seen on Google Earth. Here's a couple of examples. Unfortunately, most of them can't be seen from Google Earth, but these particular ones can be, which makes it a lot easier. But it's amazing to think that you could see these from a satellite. Also, in Bridgeport, this is after I left because drones weren't invented when I was on Bridgeport, but they're starting to use drones to try to start to map these corrals and drift fences out. And here's a good example. You can see the remains of the wood going across the screen from a drone shot. This whole idea of drones really opens up a whole new era in how we look at these game drives. Here's some more examples. And some of these, as it says here, can go for miles. I can't imagine the amount of work involved with this whole thing, because you got to remember, when these things were operational, all the wood stacked up had to be enough to keep animals from jumping over it. So there must have been quite a lot of wood. And you can see from these photos, particularly the one on the right, there's not a lot of wood in the area. So how they did some of this remains to be seen. It's just simply amazing to see these features. Another kind of a site near the game drives is what we call hearth sites, where they took the animals and had some kind of a cookout, and burned bones basically last forever. And this is one of the ways that we can date these sites and also see what kind of animals the prehistoric people were capturing in the game drives. So the top two pictures show two different kinds of hearth sites, and the bottom one shows little bits of burned antelope bone. Hunting blinds are a very important part of all game drives, just because you're going to see the animals coming from miles and miles away, and you're going to start to set up your strategy. You're going to, who knows, use smoke signals like they do in the old Western movies, or somehow let your people know where the game drive is, that the animals are coming, and be prepared. And in these hunting blinds, we have these lithic scatters, broken points, in many cases full points, just totally before the looters got to them. And you can see here they're typing some of these points, which is really one of the nice things about archaeology in the Great Basin is, in most cases, digging is not required. We can basically survey the land and the points and various features without having to do any destructive activities like digging. This is, really, and it also allows people like me to go out there who would never be able to do an excavation unit. So rock stacks, very common. If you're going to build these drift fences, you may have a few hundred yards or a mile with all this wood, but you may want to stretch it for another few miles. And so they started to use these stone dummies to look like people, to kind of frighten the animals along in a direction that they wanted them to go. And then bow stave trees. This is one of my particular favorites. To actually come up to a tree that was chopped, what they'll do is they would, let's see if my little pointer works, go ahead and make a notch here and make a notch down there. And then after it dries a little bit, actually pull this bow stave out and then use it to go ahead and, capture, kill game. But we find these quite often. The idea of coming up to a living tree and find where prehistoric people have used that tree for purposes of making a bow, it just kind of has always boggled my mind. It really gives you a connection to those prehistoric people. And then, of course, wiki up structures that the people actually lived in. There's 99% of them are gone, but there's a few of them still around on the district. And these, in some cases, are not that far from many of these game drive features. Incidentally, again, this is a picture from Bridgeport, and that mountain in the background is also on Bridgeport, to give you some idea of the scale here. Petroglyphs. There's all sorts of theories on petroglyphs, but I can tell you from just experience and not being an expert that, we find a lot of these near game drives. And I read some paper where the theory is that the leaders of these operations would actually use these petroglyphs to try to convey some meaning or directions to the people involved with the game drives. You see, in one case, there's a bighorn sheep petroglyph. But we do have those on the district where some of the animals are actually tried to depict the animals. Now, my surveys, this is kind of an example of what I did for the 14 summers, is I would go ahead and go around and follow these alignments, and using a GPS unit, track them, and then come back and put the files and open them up on various maps to see what the ground looked like. And what you can get from this image right here is these game drives are really associated with all these other features. In this case, we have a village site in the lower right. We have all sorts of these petroglyph sites kind of in strategic locations. And then we have the corrals, which are in purple, and some of these drift fences going out in various directions. This map also shows some of the historic features in the area. So it's kind of confusing, but it does show that the game drives kind of relate to kind of the way these people are living in this area. Now, probably the best thing that's happened with my work, this kind of work, is, as you can see, this is kind of preliminary. And this is basically the extent of what I did. But the good news is that the district archaeologist has picked up on these original surveys and gone out with a team and actually done some additional mapping and surveying of these sites. And all these sites have now been entered into the official Forest Service database. So, you know, all this information is now preserved, you know, forever. And I am, you know, much grateful for that, for this additional work, which was really beyond the scope of my project work. As you see here, in this case, he's got all these various blinds mapped out, and he's got some pictures. Again, shows you the complexities. Again, the animals would come in kind of in this direction, and they would come in here and circle around, and then all these people could be behind these blinds and come out and start to dispatch the animals, either with spears, arrows, or who knows, clubs. I've read somewhere that, you know, everybody was involved with this phase of the operation, including women and children running around trying to kill all the animals in the corral. Here's another configuration of a game drive. This one has what are known as Flagstone Entrance. So I'm not quite sure what that means, but these are flagstones like you'd see on a entrance to a garden or something. And again, the animals would be coming down in this direction. I can't really get that to show, but anyway, and into the corral. Also, you see projectile points have been mapped out here, as well as the blinds. Each one of these sites, you know, is very, very complicated, and quite a lot of information and things going on with these sites. Again, my thanks to Eric, the archaeologist on Bridgeport, for doing this continued work. Dating game drives, I mentioned hearths, but another way is the kind of projectile points that we find associated with these game drives. And you can see the most common one is the Elko point, which according to this is 1500 to 3500 years ago. So this will give you some idea of kind of when these things were really in, you know, the most prolific, most in operation. And a little chart on the right shows a basic breakdown of this. This is some work done by Eric and Brian Hockett, who I mentioned earlier. This is an interesting slide. I think what it shows is this kind of multiple corrals and drift fences. You know, it's all very complicated because this one may have been the first one here, but maybe 500 years later, they decided to build one here. But you see that all the animals would be coming down this way. So they abandoned this one, or maybe they abandoned this one and they used this one or this one. So it's kind of interesting when you start to figure what was going on there. Why did they change that? It just adds the complexity of these features. And another thing is this, what I call redundancy, where you have the summer range on the left and the winter range, and you have animals passing through here on this these arrows, these green arrows. And you might have a multiple series of corrals and game drives along the same route. Were they built at the same time? Were they different eras? Who knows? But it's kind of fascinating to start thinking of the strategy used by these people. There's a lot we don't know about, what was going on here. Another interesting type that I found was a cliff drop. I was up on the top of this mesa, and I noticed all sorts of projectile points and some kind of alignment, drift fence. And I noticed they came right up to a cliff where we actually found most of the broken projectile points. And the only thing we can figure is they actually drove the animals off the cliff, which is similar, I guess, to what the Great Basin or the Great Plains Indians did with the buffaloes, where they had these cliff drops. So again, that's another one. And true to the other game drives, there's a great petroglyph site associated with this particular feature. Well, here's a little summary of kind of what has been going on Bridgeport. When I first got there in, we'll say, the late 1990s and started working with game drives, the only ones that we were aware of, the ones in red. But after my work, we found another, I don't know, 40 or 50 of these game drives scattered across the district. And since I've left, they've still been busy and finding more and adding to the knowledge. So now we've got about 60 possibly on the district. So this is kind of encouraging. This is kind of an involving thing here. I mean, I think the more we get into this, the more we look for it, we're finding these features, and the more we've got to learn. Here's an overview of at least Nevada. Now, this comes from this paper that I quoted earlier. And I think if anybody is interested in more information on game drives and large-scale trapping features, you need to try to get a copy of this particular paper. It's exceptional. This map comes from that paper, and the circle shows Bridgeport. And you can see that we have arguably what the greatest concentration of these kind of features in the Great Basin, which is kind of neat. But they're scattered, throughout Nevada and actually in other states too, like Nevada or like Utah and Oregon in the Great Basin. Anyway, in closing, I just want to first of all put in a plug for a little picture book I put. Anybody that's interested in Bridgeport and maybe a little bit more on what I did with the game drives and wants to see a lot of cool pictures, this book is available on Amazon. I don't make any money on it. It's just a great little picture book of kind of some of the things I did. But the most important thing is this new book that's coming out, hopefully by the end of this year. It's going to be published by Texas A&M University Press. And I guess the tentative title is Large Scale Traps in Nevada, Eastern California, and Western Utah, but none other than Brian Hockett and Eric Dillingham, the archaeologist on Bridgeport. I am really looking forward to that major publication because that will have everything you wanted to know about game drives in the Great Basin contained in this book. So anyway, I'm really looking forward to that. So with that said, I guess I'll throw it open to questions, or let me get back to my.
Thanks, Cliff.
here.
You can leave it right there because we might have
Okay.
questions where you want to go to a different slide,
Okay.
Thanks for that presentation. It was really nice. Is there any evidence of any big game species that were part of the drives that are now extinct?
No, not really. There's still a small population of pronghorn on Bridgeport. Matter of fact, interestingly enough, there was one time I was out in the field and a small herd of a half a dozen pronghorn were drifting through a prehistoric game drive on their way to the summer range. But the primary animals, mule deer and also bighorn sheep, they have been introduced. They were pretty well shot out of certainly Bridgeport, but the Nevada Fish and Game actually has reintroduced bighorn sheep. So all the players are still there, albeit in much smaller numbers.
Excellent. And then about how old are the oldest of these known game drives in North America? Do you happen to know that?
Well, I'm going to throw out, about 5,000 years old,
Yeah.
At least in the Great Basin.
Mhm.
We were always looking for Clovis points and some really old points, but really haven't found any associated with game drives. It still remains to be a possibility, but I'm going to throw out 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. It really is tough to date these features. I mean, you can have these points, but remember, some of these game drives may have been used off and on for thousands of years.
Sure.
So some of the information from the first people that set them up may be covered over with volcanic ash. There's been a lot of active volcanoes out in this particular area that has deposited great amounts of volcanic ash. So some of this stuff may be buried. But again, we're not digging, so we don't know that information yet.
Mhm. Excellent. It's a very interesting talk because with some of my research in Italy, we have big, long lines of stones that are not strong enough to be walls, but they're not really big enough to be. We don't know what they are, and it does make me wonder if it's not some form of a game drive, or land delineation at least. And these kinds of projects, these kinds of sites that are these long sites, these incredibly large sites, like game drives being in some cases miles long, they're things that we don't typically think of as archaeological sites, and they are something that we need to consider more frequently, right?
Right. And this was the neat thing about my job, because I was doing intuitive surveys. I wasn't locked into a project area, which is quite different than I think the way archaeology mostly works. Is I was free to go those miles down a ridge line and continue to survey these areas and try to put the pieces together. These native people were just amazing in how they used the landscape. They were geniuses reading the animals, the whole topography, and getting this whole thing to work on a huge scale. See, they might have a hunting blind that miles away that was related to the game drive, and they would somehow signal their people. So they were occupying tens of thousands of acres with these facilities to make this whole thing work.
Yeah. That actually ties into another question that just got posted. Were the corrals size proportional or related to the surrounding settlement population?
No, I can't say that. I would have to think that the size of the corral was based on the kind of animals that they were going to try to capture, and maybe the size of the herd. That's the only thing I can figure. I mean, you're going to adapt your structure to the behavior of the animals. If there's a lot of animals, maybe you're going to make the corral bigger. So yeah, I think it was more that function of what the game was like back in those days.
Sure. And in addition to that too, we really wouldn't have had settlements at that point in time. You would have mobile hunters and gatherers rather than sedentary populations. So.
Right. They would move, but they would come to these game drive sites and they might spend a few weeks there.
Sure,
And one thing that's interesting is because they were in this pinyon juniper zone, the pinyon pine nut is one of the staple foods of the Great Basin Indians. So not only do they have the game migrating through, but in the fall, they could collect the pinyon nuts and gather those up, which would last them, the rest of the year.
Sure.
So it was an ideal situation for them. And they took full advantage of it.
Sure.
Yeah. That's another thing that's really interesting about this, that you know, when you've got these agricultural societies and you're raising corn and everything, you know, you've got your good years and bad years. But if you've ever been out in the Great Basin or spent some time out there, you realize it's a really harsh environment out there. It's just a tough place to make a living. And it's really almost unimaginable how these people were able to, quote, live off the land out in this country. It really shows the intelligence of these people to be able to survive out in that environment. It's a tough environment.
Absolutely. All right. Well, do we have any other questions? Maybe we want to open it up to anybody chatting. Let me try to come in here and
See, I'm
see if I
back
can
in business.
unmute
Hello.
all. So everybody can unmute if you now want to. And then if you have a question, you can ask it there.
I did have a question. I wasn't able to get it into the chat for some reason.
Okay.
But I just wondered about the small groups of who actually set up these game drives. Were they all, how were they related to each other, or were they? There were small groups that traveled independently, nomadically, or were they like from the same tribe or whatever? Or do we know?
Well,
that?
let's see. Let me see if I can try to explain this. In order to survive, at least in this case out in the Great Basin, you really kind of had to, quote, spread out. You had to, you had limited resources. And so these small family groups, I don't know, 6, 7, 10, 20 people lived together, and they would travel all sorts of different places, maybe go where the fishing is good, go where the plant gathering is good, and we'd be spread out across the landscape. But the whole idea of the game drives is that once that people started to know that the animals were starting to migrate, the people would actually come together, these various family groups, and I said, what, up to 60 or 70 or more people would gather together and settle down for a few weeks to construct and maintain these facilities. So that's when all this culture was presumably spread amongst the people. You know, the languages were developed, the customs, whatever. And then once these game drives were over, then the people would basically spread out into the landscape in their small family groups. That's kind of my crude way of trying to explain it. But you know, what's interesting is you can see evidence of that on the ground. For instance, you don't come across these humongous village sites. You know, you come across these small groups where, you know, you see 3 or 4 structures and you could figure how many people, and you realize it's just a small family group that is set up shop in one little area for a short period of time.
Thank you.
If I could add, the social aspect of this thing, Cliff has touched on. This would be a time when different family groups or small clans would get together with others in order to communicate information about locations of food and weather conditions, and also this is when boy meets girl, and you get the interrelationships of the various groups, because those small groups usually didn't have enough eligible young people from both sexes so that you could continue. So this allowed the groups to expand.
Right, and if you can stretch that back into our early beginnings, one wonders if this was the catalyst for how we just developed our culture. I mean, maybe that's stretching it a little bit, but I can't help but think that this was going on even back 100,000 years ago.
Certainly.
And maybe it just hasn't come to mainstream yet. You know, all this new research that's going on may shed more light into this aspect, and maybe we'll start to find, you know, more of these kind of facilities. I think for a moment of this Göbekli Tepe. Are you there, Tony?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Yeah, remember you gave me that book on Göbekli Tepe, and it talked about all these these points and spearheads, and they said these were hunter-gatherer people and they were building these temples. One has to wonder if there is some kind of a game drive situations going on in Turkey in these areas where Göbekli Tepe was set up. It's not mentioned in the literature, but who knows? Could it be?
No, I'm sure it was.
I would suggest that we don't know about them because nobody's looked for them.
Yeah, that's right. It's just like in my case where we just had a half a dozen to start with, and now we're up to maybe 60. So, and we're missing a lot of them. You know, some of these have disappeared off the planet because of erosion and fires and various things. So there could have been even a lot more than we're ever going to know existed out there.
I have a question for you, if I may.
Yep.
Were you located Bridgeport Ranger District? Was that near Walker Lake?
Yes.
Walker
Well,
Lake. I've been out in that area one time, and that's a fascinating area because that lake has fed by the Walker River, I believe.
Yeah.
But the lake, the lake is the end point.
Right. Well, that's indicative of the entire Great Basin. The Great Basin is, in fact, a basin. All the rivers flow into it and they never flow out. And in the case of the Walker Lake, all the watershed of the Walker, there's two Walker rivers, East Walker and West Walker. They are all on Bridgeport. Bridgeport is really the watershed for Walker Lake.
Wow.
So,
Follow up with another question. This was posted to the chat. Was the relationship to water resources typical between sites?
water resources, what, say that again?
Sorry, was the relationship to water resources typical between sites?
Well, the only thing I can really speak of as far as water, it's pretty dry out in that country, and there are various springs scattered around. And most cases where the people settled, even temporarily, there was some kind of a spring nearby. But as far as the animals moving, they pretty much, they weren't focusing on water necessarily. They were focusing on going from the various winter range to the summer range. And so water really didn't play a lot into that. But you definitely needed water if you were going to settle down for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, the one thing about archaeology out there is just so different than a lot of things I've been exposed to out here. And it was just a lot of, I don't know what the word is, a lot of fun to work out there. I really enjoyed it. I wish I was back there still, out there with the district archaeologists looking for some of these sites, and using a drone and all this new technology to try to continue to unravel the mysteries out there.
Cliff, is most of it wilderness designated, or could you take small motorized vehicles to get around out there?
I don't know, probably maybe a third of it is wilderness. A lot of this country is pretty remote, but you can get there by walking, just like we do on the Chattahoochee. It's really against the rules to take vehicular traffic off of roads. So they have the same kind of standards we have here in Georgia. So people, we just load up a pack, get plenty of water and GPS unit and head out to the field. That's what unwittingly has saved a lot of these sites from a lot of looting, is the fact that they are very remote. Unfortunately, people are starting to use motorized four-wheel drive trucks and motorcycles, and they're starting to go back into this country more and more illegally. And we are seeing some disturbance of some of these sites. That's another problem the district has to deal with. Because all this stuff is just visible on the ground, it's just open season for the looters out there. And That's kind of very disheartening. One of the things the district has to deal with quite a lot.
Other questions? Well, Cliff, thank you very much for coming to speak with us from your home there.
Thank you, Cliff.
We appreciate what you've done.
Well, thank you. It was fun.
Thank you, Cliff. Enjoyed it. Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, well, I enjoyed it too. Appreciate it.
Good.